Hello, once again, on behalf of Eric Haley, I'm Tyler Milfeld. Let's talk about purpose advertising and the credibility gap.
Consumers today expect more from a business than just making a profit. In fact, several studies have indicated a sizable percentage of consumers want brands to take a stand on social issues or to have some type of social impact, hopefully a positive social impact, beyond making a profit. And there's always the question of, will people actually put their money behind their beliefs? And again, Cone Communication indicated that yes, 66% of Americans say they would switch to a purpose-driven company to buy products and services. So there are many ways that brands can activate purpose. Tom's, for example, donating to charitable contributions. Yoplait partners with not-for-profits. Dove has product-related issues that it deals with. And Nike is famous for diving into that treacherous ground of sociopolitical issues. So several brands have a big reputation for activism. So brands such as Patagonia and Ben & Jerry's are known by consumers as activist-oriented brands. And you'll see on the next slide that when you look at perceptions of consumers, that you do see distinct differences between brands that have a reputation for activism, like Ben & Jerry's, and brands down at the bottom there, like Breyers, who are great companies, but aren't known for activism. So if you look even more closely, let's compare Ben & Jerry's to Breyers, and you look at their percentage of activism tweets, and that bears out the consumer perception that some brands are more activist-oriented than others. So Tyler, take us through our model.
So thank you, Eric. So as we were thinking about brands and different spaces in terms of activism, we're looking at two different dimensions. So as Eric just mentioned a couple of minutes ago, there are certain brands that are known for activism. So they're established activist brands. And then there are brands that move into the space for the first time. So they have activist messaging. We'll call those emergent activist brands. And so you see that continuum on the horizontal axis. On the vertical axis, you see the type of message that the brand would advertise. So there's low consensus messages and there's high consensus messages. Low consensus messages are the battlegrounds that we've talked about. Those are socio-political issues, such as immigration, such as policing, where there tends to be wide disagreement on that particular topic. Higher consensus issues tend to have broad societal agreement. Those could be what your traditional product-related ads, which we'll see in just a moment. They could also be topics such as children with cancer, supporting individuals afflicted by natural disaster, things like that, where there's generally wide agreement in support of that particular issue or topic. So we started thinking about those two different dimensions. We thought about kind of emergent versus activist or established activist brands and their reputations. And we asked, do established activist brands versus emergent activist brands actually have an advantage when they're advertising those lower consensus type issues? And we propose that yes, there is a gap that consumers will see in terms of those two brands for lower consensus issues specifically.
Theoretically, we're really talking about source credibility here. So your parents always told you, consider the source whenever somebody said anything bad about you or good about you. But it's very true. We know that people evaluate the credibility of a message based on their view of the source, and it's been shown time and time again for decades. And so we wanted to look at the source credibility literature in light of this model.
So we investigated established versus emergent activist brands and source credibility through three different studies. And these studies use both national samples and student samples. One of the reasons we were particularly interested in student samples is because they offer a more stringent test of our hypotheses. Students in Generation Z tend to be a lot more engaged in these types of issues. We also looked at low consensus versus high consensus messages, as you see on your screen. We pulled these messages from real ads and real social media posts. So they're based on things that not necessarily these brands, but other brands have said on these particular topics or issues. We wanted to do that to ensure a high degree of realism. So through these 3 studies, we tested the credibility gap. And we'll walk through 3 findings or 3 different gaps that we found through these studies. So the first relates to the credibility gap with a lower consensus message. So in the yellow, you see the established activist brand. So on the left, Nike versus ASICS. On the right, Ben & Jerry's versus Breyers. So the established activist brand is in the dark blue. The lighter blue is the emergent activist brand, the one that has moved into this space for the first time. And what we saw was a credibility gap emerge. So when an established activist brand advertises a lower consensus message, consumers perceive it to be more credible than when that same message comes from an emergent activist brand. One additional note is on the left-hand side of the screen, or of each particular experiment, you'll see the high consensus message. There is no difference between brands for those particular messages, the higher consensus message. So this gap emerges just for low consensus messages between those 2 brand types that we've talked about thus far. The second gap emerges in terms of a high consensus message versus a low consensus message. So that's what you see in the yellow highlights on the screen here. What's particularly interesting about this is that when an activist brand, such as a Patagonia, Nike, or Ben & Jerry's, in these particular cases, advertises a lower consensus message, lower consensus issue, a gap still emerges in terms of their perceived credibility. So even when a brand that's known for activism advertises an activist type message, consumers still perceive that it's less credible than when they advertise a high consensus message. And a really big implication for that particular study, or for this particular finding, is that activist brands are not immune to the backlash that we sometimes see when advertising lower consensus messages. A third finding and a third gap emerges for specific individuals. So we not only looked at brand types, but also specific individuals where we might see some differential effects in terms of the credibility gap. So we looked at individuals who are knowledgeable about the particular issue that's advertised, and it's self-reported issue knowledge. So individuals on the spectrum who say they are very knowledgeable about the issue, like immigration or policing, would be on the far right-hand side of each chart. Individuals who say they're less knowledgeable about that particular issue would be on the left-hand side of each chart. And what's interesting here is that you see a gap for individuals who report that they're knowledgeable about the advertised issue. And that gap emerges in the gray shaded areas that you see on your screen. So for individuals who are knowledgeable about the issue, they tend to reward an established activist brand like a Ben & Jerry's when it takes a stand on a lower consensus issue. They perceive it to be much more credible than an emergent activist brand advertising that same issue. And that gap, as you see on the right-hand side of each chart, is very pronounced. It's not pronounced on the left-hand side. So one implication here is that individuals who are very knowledgeable about the issue seem to kind of understand a little bit more about brands that have a right to enter into this space versus brands that don't. And they tend to punish those brands who are moving into the space for the first time because they don't perceive those particular brands like Breyers to be credible. So 3 big takeaways from this research are: one, that brand activism reputations, so brands like Patagonia, Nike, Ben & Jerry's, do appear to have an advantage in the marketplace when advertising lower consensus sociopolitical type issues. And that reputation that they've built up does give them an advantage when they're advertising activist type messages versus some of the brands that are just moving into that particular space. The second implication is from that second slide, that second finding that we talked about a moment ago, that established activist brands are not immune to backlash. So advertising a higher consensus topic, whether it be related to the product, whether it be related to just an issue that has a high level of agreement, tends to be perceived as much more credible. So even when these established brands enter these particular spaces with these messages, they're not immune to some of the backlash. And that backlash is coming from individuals who are very familiar with the issue, particularly for those emergent activist brands. So that's where you start to see that credibility difference. And the third finding, so Eric and I spent some time talking about this, which has some broad implications, is that for issues themselves, there's issues that activists bring into societal discourse to impact positive change, and that when emergent activist brands advertise these issues, it may undermine support for the issue itself because people don't perceive them as credible. And that is a really big opportunity for future research, is understanding how when emergent activist brands or particular sources enter the discourse without a lot of credibility, how does that impact support for the issue as a whole? But that's something that we certainly started to see from our data and merits further attention. So once again, we appreciate the opportunity to share our research with you on purpose advertising and the credibility gap. We appreciate the opportunity, and we'll be happy to answer any questions.